Episode 78, Eugenics in Appalachia.
Hey y'all, I'm Heather, and this is Poison Appalachia, the dark side of Appalachia. As always, thank you for listening. Did you enjoy the Black-Eyed Children episode? I did. Actually, that probably has been my favorite one so far. I just thought that was a really interesting one. But today, I want to kind of go back into the more reality aspect of things. This week's episode, I wrote and recorded right before I had my break, and I had to take care of my mom. But when I recorded the recording, it didn't come out right. I actually sounded like some sort of robot lady on it. So now I'm redoing it. I'm going to re-record it. I had never posted it or anything, but I did kind of advertise for it. So if it sounded familiar, that's probably why. This was like back in January or so. But hopefully the recording will be okay this time and I won't sound like a robot lady. I want to talk about eugenics in Appalachia and how part of that was involved in the creation of the Shenandoah National Park. It's kind of a really crazy story, involved with a lot of different things, so let's get started on it. Also, I think this episode is going to be a lot shorter. I tried to lengthen it some, but just lengthening it made it kind of more boring, so this episode is going to be a short one. I guess it is what it is. I promise the next episode will be more back to normal, I hope. So, actually, usually I have a whole plan of what I'm going to talk about for the month, and I have no idea what my next episode is going to be, so I guess we'll all be surprised next week. But let's get started on this one. The dark history of eugenics in Appalachia. There's a darker side to the history of Appalachia that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. It involves forced sterilization, state institutions, poor mountain families being labeled unfit, and a Supreme Court decision that gave the government the legal power to decide who should and should not have children. And somehow the story also intersects with the creation of one of America's most beautiful national parks, Shenandoah National Park. This is the story of eugenics in Virginia and the people who were caught in its path. So what was eugenics? If you've never heard the term before, which you probably have, Hitler was a big fan of eugenics, but if you never heard the term before, eugenics was a pseudo-scientific movement built around one disturbing idea, that humanity could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce. People considered intelligent, healthy, wealthy, or socially desirable were encouraged to have children. But people who were poor, disabled, unfit, mentally ill, epileptic, or simply considered socially undesirable could be labeled as unfit. And once someone was given this label, the consequences could be devastating. Eugenics wasn't based on legitimate genetics as we understand it today. It was fueled by prejudice against the poor, against disabled people, and against people who didn't fit into society's idea of what a desirable person should look like. The word itself was coined in 1883 by British scholar Francis Galton. By the early 20th century, the movement has spread throughout the United States, and Virginia became one of its most aggressive strongholds. Virginia's eugenics law. In 1924, Virginia passed the Eugenical Sterilization Act. The law authorized the forced sterilization of people classified as feeble-minded, mentally ill, or otherwise considered genetically defective. I hate that word, feeble-minded. It's almost as bad as the R word, which I don't like to say at all. But I'm going to be using feeble-minded a lot in this because that was the language at the time. That's what they used. So I guess it is what it is, but just know that I don't like that word. But this wasn't just happening in some distant laboratory. It was happening in the state institutions in Virginia. One of the most important was the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded near Lynchburg. The institution opened in 1910. It was originally established for people with epilepsy, but its population quickly expanded to include people labeled feeble-minded. And the people running these institutions weren't simply treating patients. Some were actively advocating sterilization. The colony's first superintendent was Albert Sidney Pretty, a physician and politician who was a committed believer in eugenics. Before Virginia's sterilization law... My stupid rooster keeps crowing. If you can hear him crowing, he's outside. For some reason, he can hear me when I'm recording my podcast, and he likes to talk back. I need to find a way to get rid of the crowing, but I'm not quite sure how yet. I'm not that technologically advanced. But I do apologize if you hear him crowing. He seems to be crowing a lot in my recent episodes, and it's just crazy. But let's go back to where I was. Sorry, I just had to give you that little side note there. The people running these institutions weren't simply treating patients. Some were advocating sterilization actively. The colony's first superintendent was Albert Sidney Pretty, a physician and a politician who was a committed believer in eugenics. Before Virginia's sterilization law even passed, Pretty had already overseen dozens of sterilizations. The new law simply gave the practice a legal framework. But Pretty wanted something more. He wanted a case that could prove the law was constitutional. And that's where Carrie Buck enters the story. Carrie Buck was an 18-year-old woman from Virginia. She was poor, she'd been raised by an adoptive family, and after she became pregnant, she was labeled feeble-minded, incorrigible, and promiscuous. But there was something the people making these accusations didn't want the public to focus on. Carrie's pregnancy was the result of rape. She had been sexually assaulted by a relative of her adopted family. Instead of protecting Carrie, the family had her committed to the Virginia colony. Her pregnancy was then used as supposed evidence of her moral and mental inferiority. And Carrie wasn't simply a patient, but she became a test case. Pretty and the institution's supporters argued that Carrie represented a hereditary defect that had to be stopped from being passed on. They pointed to Carrie, then her mother Emma, then Carrie's infant daughter Vivian, 3 generations. They claimed this provided that feeble-mindedness was hereditary, but the evidence behind those claims was deeply flawed, and some of the people testifying against Carrie had never even met her. The case was called Buck versus Bell. It eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, and on May 2nd, 1927, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 in favor of Virginia. The court upheld the state's sterilization law. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote the majority opinion, and he ended it with one of the most infamous statements in the history of American law. This is what he said, not me. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Carrie Buck was forcibly sterilized, and the decision opened the door for thousands of others to be sterilized under similar laws. The Supreme Court had effectively told states that they could take a person's availability to reproduce away in the name of protecting society. And the ruling remained on the books for decades. Virginia eventually repealed its original sterilization law in 1974, but by then, the damage had already been done. So, what does any of this have to do with the Shenandoah? This is where the story gets complicated, because eugenics didn't create Shenandoah National Park. But the same attitudes about who was considered fit, modern, valuable, or backward existed alongside the movement to create the park. And those attitudes mattered. When Shenandoah National Park was being developed in the 1930s, thousands of families were living in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Many of them farmed the land. They had homes, churches, graves, communities. There were generations of history tied to these mountains. But to many park boosters and outsiders, these mountain communities were portrayed as isolated, backward, primitive, and behind the rest of America. That image became part of the justification for removing them. And that's when the connection to eugenics becomes especially disturbing. During the creation of the Shenandoah National Park, more than 3,000 individual tracts of land were acquired through purchase or condemnation. Hundreds of families were displaced. The land was transformed into what officials and supporters considered a pristine natural landscape. But there was a problem. It wasn't untouched wilderness. People had already been living there, working the land, building homes and raising families, creating communities for years. Once the government acquired the land, many of these communities disappeared. Buildings were demolished, farmland was abandoned, and the landscape was deliberately transformed into something that looked untouched. In other words, to create a wilderness park, the government first had to remove the people who had been living there. Which didn't just happen in Shenandoah, but that's a prime example of it. There was a book called Hollow Folk. In 1933, Mendel Sherman and Thomas Henry published Hollow Folk, a study that portrayed the rural mountain people living in a region in deeply degrading terms. These people were described as isolated, backwards, impoverished, and supposedly descended from pure stock that had deteriorated over generations. The language reflected the prejudices of the time, and this is important because the same era had already given us the language of eugenics. Some people were considered genetically inferior, some people were considered socially inferior, some people were considered obstacles to progress, and once society decides that certain people are the problem, removing them becomes much easier to justify. And here's where the history becomes even darker. Some people displaced from the park area ended up in institutions, and Virginia state institutions were deeply connected to the eugenics system. The same state was forcibly sterilizing people it considered unfit, was also deciding who belonged in institutions and who didn't. Not every person removed from the Shenandoah region was institutionalized, and we shouldn't imply that the park's creation was simply a sterilization program. But the systems existed at the same time. They were built on some of the same prejudices, and they operated within the same culture that increasingly viewed poor rural people as backward and in need of being controlled, removed, or improved. The connection is uncomfortable, but that's exactly why it's worth talking about. And just think, this was like less than 100 years ago. It just blows my mind. And the story didn't end in 1927. You might think that once the Supreme Court made its decision, this chapter of history was over, but it wasn't. Virginia's eugenics program continued for decades. Thousands of people were forcibly sterilized, institutions continued to operate, and the idea that the government could determine who was fit to reproduce remained embedded in the state policy long after public began turning against eugenics. The horrors of Nazi Germany eventually made eugenics internationally infamous. But America had already been doing this, and Virginia had been one of the states leading the way. Carrie Buck, back to her, she died in 1983. For most of her life, she wasn't remembered as a victim of one of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions in American history. She was remembered through labels imposed upon her: feeble-minded, promiscuous, unfit. But historians later discovered a much different story. A young woman who was a victim of sexual assault. A person caught inside a system that had already decided what she was before she ever had a chance to defend herself. And her daughter Vivian, the third generation supposedly proof of hereditary feeble-mindedness, was later have found to be an average student. The evidence used to justify Carrie Buck's sterilization was never what the court portrayed it to be. It took decades for Virginia to formally acknowledge what had happened. In 2001, the Virginia General Assembly expressed profound regret for the damage caused by eugenics. The following year, the lawmakers honored Carrie Buck and condemned the Buck v. Bell decision. And in 2002, a historical marker was placed in Charlottesville recognizing Carrie Buck. But there's something to the story that still bothers me. It isn't simply that this happened nearly 100 years ago. It's that it happened because ordinary humans were given labels: poor, disabled, backward, unfit. And those labels were accepted. It became easier to take away from people's home, their freedom, their dignity, and eventually their ability to have children. And partially because of this, I think, is why we have such negative connotations for Appalachian people. A lot of people see us from the outside world as poor, inbred, uneducated, uncivilized, feeble-minded. And, a lot of our society perpetuated that with, comics like Snuffy Smith. Have you ever read that? I remember reading that when I was a kid. Even shows like Mom, Pa, Kettle, the Beverly Hillbillies, all of that. It just perpetuates on that backward people kind of thing that live in the mountains and don't know what the real world's like, and it's just ridiculous. That's one of the things that I created this podcast for, was to talk about things like that. And also, there's a lot of dark stuff that has happened in Appalachia that was because of Appalachians, but there's a lot more dark stuff that's happened in Appalachia because of the way that society views us, and it just really irks me. But I want to go back to finish this podcast. I just wanted to talk about that little side note for a minute, that we're more than what society thinks we are. And I think, the Appalachia of today, a lot of people are seeing what we're really like. But there's still a lot of that stereotypes that people still have in mind when they think of Appalachians. So it's just important to cover stuff like this and talk about it because of that. But let's finish the podcast here. So the poison part of the story for Poison Appalachia. When we look at the Shenandoah National Park today, it's easy to see the beauty. The mountains, the forest, the overlooks, the winding roads, and it is beautiful. So beautiful. Smoky Mountains are beautiful too. Like, just, if you go, the whole part of Appalachia is beautiful. We live in such a beautiful area. But underneath the beauty is another story. A story about people who live there. People who were told their homes were in the way. People who lost land that had been in their families for generations. And a society that was becoming increasingly comfortable deciding which people belonged and which people didn't. Here's the part of Appalachian history I don't want us to forget. Because the darkest stories aren't always hiding in abandoned buildings or haunted hollows. Sometimes they're buried beneath the places we consider beautiful. And sometimes the poison isn't the soil. It's the ideas that people once believed were perfectly acceptable. This is Poison Appalachia, and sometimes the history we need to remember most is the history that makes us uncomfortable. So, another side note here. I'm going off the script a lot today, but that's okay. It's my podcast and I get to do what I want to do, right? But just the same with like data centers, they're destroying our land. They're destroying beautiful areas. And they're taking our water to make these data centers. And I'm not ignorant in thinking that our world is becoming more and more AI and computer ran and all of that. So we do need ways to run that world. But there has to be better ways than the expensive Appalachia. And people, I don't think, realize the beauty of Appalachia unless they've been there. So we just need to get the word out. Let people know that real people live here. We're people, we're workers, we're families, we're people that are normal people. We're not a bunch of redneck hillbillies, and we're not a bunch of inbred imbeciles. We are people just like everybody else, and I think that we need to look at our land a little more before destroying it with data centers and stuff. I try not to get political on this, and I don't think this is a political issue. This is just an issue about the land that we live in, the land that we love, and we need to cherish it and not destroy it for the sake of industry. So, that's my other side tangent. Sorry if this episode's been a little preachy, but sometimes we need to have our toes stepped on, so I hope you have enjoyed it. I know this episode is shorter. I mentioned that at the beginning. But I think this is a good place to end it. So just remember the land that we all love. And remember that the people that live there are real people and not just caricatures. So as always, thank you for listening. You can follow me on social media under Poison Appalachia. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, Lemonade, TikTok, Blue Sky, and YouTube. And also, I've mentioned in the past couple episodes, I found a new social media called Gist, Gist. I'm trying it out. I'm not sure. We'll see. So far, so good, but I don't really know that a lot of people are on it. So if you're on it, check me out on there under Poison Appalachia. And if you could, on the podcast platform you listen to, could you please like and rate me and share me, please? Let everybody know about my podcast. Get the word out. And hopefully we'll become more than just a podcast. And we'll become a community that can discuss things like this and talk about our real life. But anyhow, thank you all for listening. And have a great week. Bye.